Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcasts with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
This is the Future Tech Podcast. I am Alan Thomas, and today I have Fennie Wang with me, co-founder of IXO. How are you doing?
I'm very good. How about yourself?
Oh, I'm doing pretty well. Let's jump right in. Tell us about IXO and who you guys are and what you guys do.
Yes, so IXO, we are the blockchain for impact. So what does that mean? That means all kinds of sustainable development and social impact projects need some kind of measurement in terms of whether or not those programs and interventions are actually effective in achieving certain outcomes and reaching their beneficiaries and making sure that we're funding the right kinds of interventions. So it's been a real problem for that industry in terms of their data measurement. And so what we've seen is an opportunity here to use blockchain and other kinds of exponential technology, such as big data, machine learning, and IoT sensor technology as a way to scale our ability to evaluate these different kinds of projects, and also to create new models and new paradigms for how we can fund those types of interventions. So that's what IXO does in a nutshell. I was on your podcast a few months earlier, back in December. So I'm also very happy to be back to reintroduce IXO to your audience and give some updates on what we're up to.
Oh, that'd be great. Let's jump right into that. What are some of the updates? What are some of the changes made since then?
Good. So I think in December we discussed a little bit about IXO's background. We talked about some of our existing projects. So one of them being the Ampli project, which is focused on preschool attendance records in South Africa. So that was UNICEF Ventures' first blockchain investment. And we've, to date, since 2016, have tokenized more than 60,000 preschool attendance records across 50 plus preschools in South Africa. So what does it mean to tokenize something? The simple way to think about tokenization is it's creating a digital asset that represents some kind of real world asset or piece of information like data. So in this case, the attendance records would be the real world data asset. And we've created now a digital asset that references this real life data structure. So when you create when you create a digital asset, now you can start transacting that digital asset on a decentralized type ledger. So that's super exciting in terms of how you can think about funding different kinds of transactions in the real world, including social outcomes. So this is a whole new way to think about philanthropy and a whole new way of thinking about impact investing that is focused on financing for success and financing for results. So in the case of Ampli in South Africa, what the government has done is create a program to incentivize preschool attendance. So if you're a preschool operator, you can receive subsidies from the government if you can show proof of attendance. So now you can see why it's very creative to think about how we can make that process more efficient and effective. So teachers can take attendance. That attendance record it's turned into a digital asset, and that digital asset can be funded. So that's where we want to take this product in the future is being able to link those payment flows to that proof of attendance. So Ampli is a project that we want to expand into other countries outside of South Africa. So we're looking at other countries in UNICEF country offices, and also even in right here in the States. It's also a mechanism that is equally relevant for developed countries such as New York City and New York State. So we've had some early stage discussions with with lawmakers in New York State, in New York City, around how we can use this type of mechanism to measure the effectiveness of, say, mentoring programs, the effectiveness of services for underprivileged kids, to see whether there is an outcome tied to their school performance, to their attendance rates, and so forth. So this is all very exciting. And on top of that, how can we create digital histories for the students themselves that they can carry with them globally and throughout their lives? So being able to prove to anyone in a way that they can control and own that they've attended school, that they've engaged in these different types of mentoring programs and so forth. So could that help people in terms of alternative credit histories and credit scores, in terms of job applications? So the future is super exciting when we think about the tools we can use to really empower people to show that they have a certain credibility or reputation, even though they've been marginalized from traditional institutions. So that's really where we want to take things. And other stuff we've got in the works is around creating smart impact bonds. So the idea of an impact bond is that you've got investors who put in money into a project, and they get paid a return on that investment if and only if those outcomes for the program are met. So again, this is a perfect kind of use case for the technologies that we want to build, being able to show on the blockchain that a certain outcome has been achieved, and then we can tie the funding flows to that digital asset that shows the outcomes. So that's something we're working on with UBS Optimus Foundation in Switzerland. They are the foundation arm of UBS Bank. And so they're a repeat investor in these types of mechanisms, and they're working on a impact bond project in India for girls' education. And so how do we use these tools to scale the evaluation of the learning outcomes on the ground in real time? And then that's the basis for which UBS can be repaid a return on their investment. So these are the different kinds of models that we're working on, and we're super excited. And we also recently announced a partnership with Seneca Zoos. They're a zoo based in Rochester, New York, but they do all kinds of conservation projects with reforestation around the world, particularly in Madagascar. So we're super excited about that. So how can we use blockchain to tag and track trees so that we can prove that there's been reforestation in this particular area? And that's very important in terms of the research that various conservationists, environmentalists do. So that's super exciting in terms of being able to expand into that sector around conservation, reforestation, potentially also certifying carbon sinks from reforestation projects, and also supply chain. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but we've got a lot going on, so I wanted to let the world know what we're up to.
Oh no, that's exactly what you're here for. We want to hear about all these great things that you guys are doing. The first question that kind of popped off in my head was, how do you decide where to focus your efforts with all this, all the different areas you could go to? How did you decide initially to focus on tokenizing the preschool records? Let's start with that project.
Yes. So my team is in South Africa. They're in Cape Town. So that project started locally because preschool education, early childhood development is a huge theme in South Africa. So that's where that project first came about. And sometimes you kind of have to follow where the priorities are, because that's where you'll get traction and funding and attention. And so we've started with that, and that was also our connection with UNICEF Ventures, because they're very focused also on these focus areas around childhood development and so forth. That's part of UNICEF's mandate. So that's where that came about. In terms of the other projects, some of it, people kind of reach out to you because they hear about you. And so like-minded folks find each other. And that's quite important in this space, as we've discovered. We work in the sustainable development and impact space where technology doesn't always kind kind of follow, doesn't lead, I should say. So you have to find the early adopters in the space that get what you're doing. They get the vision of using this technology. They see it. Otherwise, it's a really long education process trying to get someone who's like, okay, what's blockchain? Is it just Bitcoin? Right. So that's such a long education process. So you kind of have to let the early adopters in their respective fields come and find you if you're able to articulate your story or narrative, right? So that's how Seneca Zeus came to us. They found us and they say, hey, we've heard about you guys through our Salesforce reps, and we've been looking for ways to look at documenting and proving, reforestation, tracking that, and we've been studying, decentralized mechanisms and blockchain. So you kind of have to find those kinds of folks. That makes that process a lot easier in terms of getting stakeholder engagement, getting projects actually off the ground. So that's one thing that we've learned.
And I just wanted to ask a little bit more about the impact bonds. I think we really wanted, I think our listeners would definitely want to hear a little bit more about how they work and their uses and just a little bit more detail about them.
Sure. So the impact bond model is really new. It's probably slightly younger than blockchain. If you think blockchain, Bitcoin white paper came out in 2008. First block was 2009. Well, the first impact bond was 2010. So it's a little bit younger than the whole blockchain industry. And the idea the first impact bond came out of the UK. So the program was for a prison recidivism reduction intervention. So training low-level offenders in job skills. The thesis being that if we give them these kind of tools, they will not end up repeating the same patterns of behaviors that get them in trouble and arrested and back in jail. So how do we create a program that trains them for this? And we can use private money to fund that program. And the government will only pay for that program if it's been proven to be effective. So that was the idea behind impact bonds. In the original form, you can think of it as like a public-private partnership whereby private sector has a bit more risk capability to take on innovative new projects and see if they work or not, experiments, whereas government, because they have this kind of political considerations around them, right, in terms of, you put your money into this project and it didn't work, and then they'll never be able to experiment again. So that was the original thinking around the impact bond model. So you have the private investors that fund the program, and the government serving as what's called an outcomes funder. So they only pay for the project and repay the private investors if and only if pre-agreed outcome metrics for the program are met, so that we can say, hey, this program was successful. So that's the genesis of how that came about. And the first one was with a prison called the Peterborough Prison in the UK, and actually it was successful in reducing the recidivism rates of the target population. And so there have been other impact bonds throughout the UK and through the US, and also in developing countries. So now it's evolved a little bit, whereby the outcomes funder doesn't necessarily have to be a government. It could be a major foundation that's also interested in funding for outcomes and are willing to split the risk with other private funders. So UBS is an example of a private funder. They're an impact investor. In the case of their development impact bond in India, the outcomes funder is a major foundation called the Children's Investment Fund, rather than a government entity. So the Children's Investment Fund will repay UBS Optimus Foundation their principal plus a return. Usually it's like an 8 to 10% coupon rate if the learning outcomes are met under that program. So that's generally the mechanism of how these impact bonds work. Now, impact bonds are not actually bonds the way we think of corporate bonds or government bonds that actually trade on the market. They're contractual arrangements between the various different parties and stakeholders. So the transaction fees and the evaluation monitoring fees are quite expensive, which makes it hard for these impact bond mechanisms to scale. And because they're quite risky, UBS, if they put in 10 million to a project, they may not get anything back, or they're going to have to wait a number of years before they can receive any return. And so they're very keen at looking at tools like blockchain, looking at tools like IoT sensors or data algorithms to see how that evaluation process can be scaled so that we get information in real time, how we can use smart contracts to reduce the transaction cost of arranging these types of mechanisms, right? So reducing the legal fees, reducing the administration fees for transacting these types of mechanisms. And if you're able to get information flows in real time, then you're able to better have a sense of your risk and de-risk. So in the future, you can start imagining an impact bond that actually looks like a real tradable, investable investment instrument, whereby we can diversify some of that risk amongst a pool of impact investors. So UBS can be the underwriter, meaning they put the initial money into developing this impact bond project and doing the due diligence, but they can de-risk a little bit by reselling a portion of their commitment to people like maybe you and me, or other investors who may be high net worth individuals, other foundations, other family offices that are interested in these types of programs, and they want to participate in these kind of mechanisms, but maybe they don't have the resources to do the due diligence in the way that UBS Optimist Foundation can, because they have that expertise. So that allows us to bring in our capital into these kind of projects. It allows UBS to de-risk and allows them to redeploy capital faster in other innovative impact bond projects. So then we can pool more capital into these kinds of innovative projects that spread the risk around between different parties. So I think that's hugely exciting, because now what we're doing is creating capital markets for social impact. And I think that's the way that the world should move towards, is that there's a lot of money out there, and we should be deploying it towards achieving actual good outcomes that benefit all of us.
So do you think that if impact bonds, if there are just a few more projects or a couple of more years under its belt, do you think that will help to bring some of those costs down to make it more widely adopted?
Yeah, I think with best practices, certainly that can proving the track record certainly can help. The more case studies you have, the more you can kind of preach that gospel to the world and get people to understand. In the same way that blockchain's taken 10 years for people to kind of reach sort of mainstream consciousness of what it is, and we're only at the beginning. Same thing, we're only at the beginning, and how can we merge different technology tools that enable us to accelerate the development, accelerate, or actually, I should say, solve maybe some of the challenges and roadblocks, right? So certainly, the more we have track record and case studies, that's helpful, and figuring out what exactly is preventing us from scaling that model. Is it because of the cost of the evaluation and monitoring? How can we use this new technology around blockchain and IoT sensors to reduce some of those costs? How do we look at other kinds of mechanisms to open up these models to a wider audience?
So it does sound like maybe the early adopters are the key to getting to that tipping point, right?
Yes, the early adopters, but also early adopters who are willing to see how fast the market can change. So one thing I've also noticed working kind of in the space with climate finance and other impact investors is that there's a little bit of protectionism. So you really can, it's like when you bring in new technology, it's a bit of a litmus test some people are like very defensive. They're like, we've spent 10, 15 years building the carbon markets and a market for carbon credits, and why do you guys want to suddenly come in and create a market for carbon tokens? And you have to try to get them to see that the technology is an enabling technology, and that can expand the scope of their market that they've worked really hard to build, right, and help them scale that market. Other people come up and they take a really proactive approach, and they come up and they say, "Hey, I'm a impact evaluator, and my job is going to go away because of this technology, but I'm not defensive about it. I want to pivot, and I want to learn how I can use this to change my business models and to work with that." So it's quite interesting to see how humans and institutions react to change, and how willing they are to experiment with it. So again, like I said, you got to go with the folks that come to you. They see the vision, they see where things are going, and they're willing to work with you, knowing that they accept that maybe their jobs or their roles will become disintermediated, or that it will change, and they're willing to engage in that change.
And so in the midst of all these projects that you guys have going on, have there been any ideas or developments that somebody's brought to you and maybe you say, well, that's a little bit too ambitious of a project to take on today, but maybe a year or two down the road?
Yeah, we never turn away from ambitious. The scale of the vision is what gets us excited, because that's where you can show exponential change, but you kind of have to break it down, right? So you want to make sure there's a big enough vision that's worthwhile, but then you break it down and say, well, how do we start with an initial pilot to test how this can work, and then from that we can then learn how to make changes and how to scale it up, right? So we've had lunch with folks who are like, we want to do $1 billion fund that invests in sustainable forests in South America, because it's a proven model that when you think of the forest as a factory that produces carbon sinks, that produces cacao, that produces all these other kinds of products, it's actually a good financial return. And we want to also be able to measure the social and environmental returns, right? So big scale thinking is what gets us excited. And then we say, okay, well, how do we start small with this particular pilot project? We identify what exactly we want to measure. We identify what exactly we want to achieve as the first kind of initial test, right? Being to certify this supply of trees, being to tokenize this, set of data around the particular effects, right? So you have to get down into the details in terms of exactly what you want to measure. So that's usually how we work with the partners that approach us.
And you guys have done a lot in just a few months, but what's the roadmap look like over the next year or two? I'm sure it's chock full of projects.
Yeah, so we are getting ready to release the MVP of our protocol end of June, early July. So look out for that. What this means is that the core basic functionalities of our blockchain will be available for alpha testing amongst a group of early adopters, kind of like our friends and family, give us feedback. So what this means is that anyone will be able to create their own digital ID. They'll be able to create their own impact database, so they can start making claims about something that they're doing in the world, something that their project has achieved, and have that verified. And then there's a record of all of that that's associated with their digital ID. So that's super exciting in terms of what we built. It's a real innovation in database technology. It's the first kind of use case around digital IDs, this idea of self-sovereign identities. So being able to own your own ID, being able to own your own data, and how you can transact with your own data is super important. And it's also quite timely, especially when you've seen all the latest talk with Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg going in front of the Senate and trying to justify what happened, in terms of people's data, without their permission, how it's been used, right? So that's the current status quo, but that's not what the future is going to look like in terms of the data economy, in terms of how we want the internet economy to look like. People should be able to own their own data, and that also starts with being to own their own identity and being to associate information and reputation with their own identity.
And I personally love the idea that actually being able to have full control of your identity and everything, it kind of goes along with it. Like I said, it almost seems like data breaches or data events are becoming commonplace, and that is definitely not a good thing. Exactly.
And so, and it's also like it's a data security question, but it's also an economic question. It's like, well, if I'm producing this content and this information, why shouldn't I be the one monetizing or benefiting from it? Why does Facebook monopolize that network? Why does Facebook monopolize and basically co-opted my data, right? So they own that data, not me, right? Is there a new economic bargain that allows me to also partake in the economic gains of my contribution to an information network?
Right. You should get paid for your own data because it's your data, right?
Exactly. Like I'm out there building Facebook's enterprise value by interacting on Facebook, right? So how do I get a share of that? And that's what all these decentralized systems are thinking about. How do we create decentralized economic models that allow participation and reward for our participation? So it's a much more kind of cooperative thinking in that sense, in terms of how we want to build the internet economy. How do we want to build open networks? So that's super exciting. And what we're doing is applying that specifically in the scope of philanthropy, impact investing, sustainable development, and how do we use that to further the sustainable development goals that the UN has put out. So that's our specific domain.
Okay. And are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with about IXO and the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, so there's a lot of work to be done. We're a small but growing and mighty team. I'm super excited that this is a team that is coming out of South Africa, which is maybe not where you normally think of technology innovation coming from, but that also speaks to the power of the blockchain movement, that the development of the space comes from all over the world. It shouldn't just be concentrated in Silicon Valley, in New York, where the money is, or in Berlin or elsewhere, but it really is about spreading the capacity development of talent globally. And in order for decentralized systems to work, in order for us to achieve social impact at scale, we need people to actively participate. We need people to be willing to experiment. We need people to be willing to partake in this. So I guess my message is, get active in this, start learning, what's going on in the space, learn to code, learn to also think about new economic models for what a decentralized economy looks like. And come and follow us, come and learn with us. So you can find us on our website, IXO.network. We're on Telegram. We've got GitHub. So just come and participate, because we can't do this without active participation.
Okay. And thank you, Fennie, for coming on and giving us your time and information, and especially the updates. We love to hear about the changes from the first time we talked to you to the next time. So I'm sure we'll be back with some more updates in just a short while. So that'll be great.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.